We welcome you to go back and get some more to eat and drink throughout the afternoon. And let me first commend you for this magnificent turnout. It obviously speaks volumes about Grabs. I look at it and I say, well, unless you're a head of state, a rock star, or the founder of a religious order, you probably can't expect this kind of attendance when your time comes. We wrestled with what to do after the news, which of course we found very shocking at Christmas time. It was shocking even though he'd been obviously very sick. We wrestled with what to do, and it was very important for us to do something with the appropriate solemnity, with the dignity of the occasion, respect for the memory of the man who's passed. And so then we asked ourselves, well, what would Grabs say? WWGS, and we heard a resounding, fuck that. So we decided to hold an event that he would have liked to have come to. And maybe, for all we know, he's here now. Thanks to everybody who pulled this together. We've got food and drink. One suggestion we're not going to follow up, Marlena Telvik suggested maybe we end the occasion by joining hands and singing in unison, "You are the wind beneath my wings." The idea being that it would just force him to show up out of sheer disgust. We slipped up a little bit. I noticed in the lobby we did call this a celebration of Grabs. And I know the very idea is enough to get him flipping us the bird from wherever he currently resides, and I hear him muttering new agey bullshit. So what we're going to do is eat and drink, talk to each other about Grabs and anything else the memory of our time with him provokes. We've got some scheduled speakers, and then we'll open the mic to everybody who's got something they want to say. It was my misfortune to know Paul Grabowicz for only the last 3 years of his life. I never worked alongside him in a newsroom. I never taught alongside him in a classroom. And I regret that. Our relationship was purely professional. We never socialized outside of work. So to be honest, I have to confine myself to describing what I think his impact in the Graduate School of Journalism has been. And I have to tell you, I think it was and remains profound. Other people will know better and will presumably talk about the influence he had on particular curricular innovations, and he was, as the obit we put together for him says, a pioneer in understanding the extent and the importance of the digital transformation of journalism, and in making sure that this school was and remains in the vanguard of that. The school's instructional mandate, in my opinion, reflects his influence more than it does the influence of any other single individual. And I go further. Institutions are defined by their cultures. And I tell you in all candor, I don't think any single individual defined the J School's culture as fully as Grabs did. Grabs was the eternally skeptical believer. He retained the endlessly disappointed commitments of his generation. He was Charlie Brown having the football yanked away time and again and getting up and kicking at it again and again. He ignored and repudiated the distinction between the sacred and the profane and made profanity almost sacramental. On the admissions committee where we served together, he would warn about the school's perpetual appeal to the activists, the tree huggers, the people who imagine journalism as a tool of social betterment rather than as an elusive craft to be mastered. If journalism is taken over by the advocates, who the hell is going to keep an eye on them? And yet, almost invariably, he would end up voting to let the advocates in. And heaven knows he loved his students. He would do whatever he could for them. He gave out the money he controlled without hesitation. He pulled the hours. He quietly reveled in their achievements. He tracked their career progress faithfully and proudly. We talked a fair amount over the last year of his life. He would amble into my office and sit down and talk. As his condition worsened, I told him that without him, while I'm still getting the same volume of abuse, the quality is gone. There are things now I would dearly love to be able to talk about with him, get his opinion on, but now I'm getting morbid. Next thing we know, it'll be the wind beneath my wings. So that's my lead-off comments. Let me just segue. The first person on among the scheduled speakers is Eric Newton. Eric is unable to be here. He had to fly back east, Florida, but he sent along his comments, which I'll now read to you. Eric Newton had worked with Grabowicz at the Oakland Tribune. He then went on to become the head of journalism at the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation. Very influential guy, and he now is at Arizona State University. I am sorry I can't be there, Eric writes. An illness in the family is keeping me in Florida, but my thoughts and Mary Ann's are with you. Paul was a good friend, which is saying something because there just aren't that many good ones. I loved his brilliance and compassion, all wrapped in that amazing character. His center of gravity, great journalism, more than once brought me back from the edge. He was and remains an American original. Paul faced the strangeness of the world with a line from the movie A Shot in the Dark. Inspector Clouseau falls into a fountain. Change clothes now, he's told, or you'll get pneumonia. Yes, I probably will, Clouseau says, but it's all part of life's rich pageant, you know. Investigative reporters see a lot of life's rich pageant. One of the strangest things of all is that you can save the lives of people you will never meet, people who don't know that your reporting started a chain of events that ended with a trauma care center being created or a murderer being put away. Even journalists often don't know exactly who we saved. Telling the hard truths that point to better ways, at least for Paul and the rest of us decades ago, and another time and place, was enough. A journalist who does story after story under these conditions, who specializes in bad news that makes good things happen, who does the most difficult stories without seeking credit, whose work preserves the lives of people unknown and unknowing, this journalist is more than professional, more than patient. This person, no matter what he says, secretly is full of hope. It was a great day when Paul went to UC Berkeley. He saved the journalism school, and in a way it saved him too, because he could see every day in the students how much of a difference he made. Through them and their students and theirs, the idea of doing the right thing, doing great journalism, will stay alive. I can just hear Paul now. Memorials are absurd. Hugging, kumbaya, arg. To which I would have loved to nudge my friend one last time and say, fuck you, man, we love you.
Hi, I'm Stephanie, and this is going to be Paul Grabowicz, the early years. Most of you here knew him as Grabs, but to me and some of his oldest friends who are here today, he was Paul. Although I did find a variety of other affectionate nicknames, Grabo, Grab-a-shit, Grabowicz. I met Paul at Ithaca College during my junior year in 1971 through one of my favorite sociology professors, Jules Bergevin. Jules had taught Paul in 1967 at Clarkson College of Technology, now Clarkson University, in the frozen north of Potsdam, New York. Paul was a 17-year-old freshman physics major from a small, rural, working-class town in southwestern Massachusetts. He had been his high school's valedictorian and wrote his speech on patriotism in the vein of JFK and service to your country. He was an only child and had recently lost his father. He signed up for Intro to Sociology with Jules and discovered a whole new world. Jules was a captivating lecturer. I remember one class I took with him, and as he was talking near the end of class, he started walking up the stairs to the doors in the rear of the hall, and we all just swiveled in our seats to watch and listen as he made his last remark, opened the door, and walked out. We were all just sitting there, watching the door close behind him. Paul became very close with Jules and his family that year. But Paul was restless and dissatisfied with Clarkson and no longer wanted to study physics. He wanted to transfer. He applied to Cal, Reed College, and Brandeis, and was accepted at all three. He chose Cal because they gave him the most money. Jules, meanwhile, was fired from Clarkson. He had wiped his hands on the American flag as a political act during a lecture. He accepted a position at Ithaca College. That summer, Paul's mother died of cancer. He stopped to see Jules in Ithaca in September on his way out west, with his life in his car, 18 years old, alone, no parents, heading to Berkeley. 1968 in Berkeley. So much has been written about my generation, but then we felt like we wanted to break all the molds, questioning everything, staring into the bottomless pit of life in front of us with no guides to help us navigate it. The hate may have been sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but Berkeley was politics, idealism, revolution, and angst. I found a flyer Paul kept when he arrived for Disorientation Week. Paul finished most of his coursework in 1971, but didn't officially graduate until 73, Phi Beta Kappa. He still traveled back east to see Jules and his family 3 or 4 times a year. It was the only family he had, and the only ones who had known him as a young, impressionable teenager, and now with his eyes open to injustice and war and corruption. Jules introduced us during one of those visits, and Paul was everything Jules said he was: incredibly intelligent, intellectually curious and questioning, idealistic, political, sensitive, cynical to hide his vulnerability, and immediately trustworthy. He was the first person I ever felt I could count on. No matter what, he would be there for you. Paul settled in Ithaca for some months. We marched on Washington together. We taught together in a middle school in a small village outside of Ithaca, where they gave us the misfits, the behavior problems, the socially awkward kids for a few hours each day. I have no memory of what we did with them. But after 3 months or so, we were fired. Too radical, outside agitators. Paul was restless. He needed to get back to Berkeley, away from the provincialism of upstate New York. I followed after my graduation. He was involved in local politics. We both worked on the McGovern campaign. But in 1973, he was disillusioned and restless again and wanted to try the East Coast again. Here's what I wrote to him in a letter at that time. There truly seems to be a Paul Grabowicz East and a Paul Grabowicz West. The eastern side of you seems more rooted, attached to a past, to a heritage. You are more Paul as an extension, a product of a family, a town, a childhood, a coming-aware process. Sometimes you seem more serene in the East. The Paul Grabowicz West is a man without a past, as if your life began when you passed the sign that said Berkeley, or maybe when you crossed the Rocky Mountains. Life starts anew. There's a freshness, a vitality, a letting out and a letting go to the Paul Grabowicz West. You take more chances, a few more risks, because it seems like that is the way one survives out here. Paul went east with his friend Lee Jones, who we met during the McGovern campaign. After stopping to see Jules, they landed in Boston, working at Victoria Station, a restaurant chain back then. Paul was a dishwasher. I remember asking him, "Didn't you want to be a waiter and make more money?" He said, "No, I didn't want to be out there with all those people." One of his coworkers was John Harrigan, who he introduced me to years later back in Berkeley, and who I married. Of course, when John and I started seeing each other, Paul was pissed. "Great, when you break up, you're going to blame me and I'll lose both of you as friends." Didn't happen. In 1975, Paul was considering grad school. Here's what Jules wrote about him in a letter of recommendation. He is exceptional, intelligent, extremely well-read. He is an excellent and helpful critic and writes really well. And then I have seen Paul teach. In fact, he taught several of my classes when he lived in Ithaca for 4 months. He is an amazing teacher, insightful, perceptive, full of useful ideas and new prospects about our changing reality. If you can, invite him to teach. Give him the opportunity. I am certain that student feedback will show him to be exceptional. That was 1975. Paul didn't go to grad school. He became a journalist. Years passed. We remained close. He found Anne and finally found his own family. We each married. He was the best man in our wedding, and a year later, John was the best man in his. When John and I were able to buy a house, Paul showed us Pleasant Hill, where he and Ann had lived for years. Still a throwback to the 50s and 60s, where kids ride their bikes and the ice cream truck comes around every night in the summer. We bought a house and have lived less than a mile from them for over 20 years. So Paul had a big influence in my life. I followed him to Berkeley. He introduced me to my future husband, and he helped us find our home. I remember on Paul's 45th birthday, he came over and he sat at my kitchen table lamenting, "Jesus, 45? How can that be? Where did it all go? We were so young." He wasn't so much lamenting his lost youth or missed opportunities as the loss of something more subtle, his idealism, his vulnerability, his hope. That was before he started teaching here. And I remember another conversation we had after he began teaching at the J School. I said it was the perfect job for him. I don't know, maybe I was flashing back to those months at the middle school. Of course, he scoffed. Why? What could I possibly have to teach anyone? But it was the perfect job. And as much as you all feel that he gave you so much, taught you so much, was there for you always, and was a great Santa, you gave him so much. You gave him back that idealism and exuberance and hope for the future. Your energy infused him. You gave him a home. A few months before he died, he told me he had no regrets. He felt he had led a good life and thought he had done some good things. Yes, you did, Paul. Yes, you did.
Quite a crowd. So I'm John Harrigan, Stephanie's husband, and I hope I never wanted to emulate John Boehner, so I hope I don't do that. I really, really hate being here today because I hate losing Paul. Excuse me. After JFK died, one of his posse, might have been Kenny O'Donnell, the journalists in the room can fact check me on that one, wrote a book called Johnny, We Hardly Knew Ye. Well, Paul, we hardly knew ye. He was a complicated man with many facets to him, and yet at his core he was simply put, like most of us, simply hoping to do his part to shape a better world than the one he was born into. And he was going to do his damnedest to make that happen. And by the way, fuck you if you stood in his way. Seems to be a theme that's probably going to develop further. Craig Staats agrees. Look around you. Paul sold out the joint today. He would be amazed, probably a bit depressed by it, but fundamentally moved. We, his posse, his friends and colleagues, students and teachers, fellow passengers on the whirlwind tour that was his life, have gathered one last time to honor him and all that he stood for. Paul stood, above all else, for intellectual integrity and curiosity. He was fiercely honest, sometimes brutally so, which, by the way, made us love him even more. It could not abide bullshit in any of its forms. He was probably the smartest person I've ever known, certainly the most well-read. And to the end, his intellectual itch for knowledge of anything, of whatever, was profound and left one feeling just a tad innocuous in comparison. I have a few brief tales, but first let me personally say to Annie how very sorry I am that we're here today. Carolyn will shortly tell you more about the last year and the challenges that Paul and Ann faced. But let me just say that, Annie, you're a rock. On top of caring for your 90-year-old mom on a daily basis at home, who she moved out from Pennsylvania to do that, these past couple of years, you faced cancer with Paul and saw him through a very, very trying time. You allowed him to hold on to his hope until he was ready to see the end. You fretted in private more than with him. You nursed and you loved him as you always had. Paul was a damaged vortex of angst and loneliness when you met him, and you calmed him, you loved him, you provided the stable environment he'd always chased since losing his parents as a teenager. As I promised Paul many times on our walks over the past year, we will always be there for you. I want to acknowledge and thank on behalf of Paul and Annie some longtime friends who have traveled far and wide to be here today. Leslie Oat-Richer, a friend from Ithaca days, is here from Boston, along with her daughter, Dr. Elizabeth Richer, who's recently emigrated from the Bay State, Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of, to the Bay Area, as Paul and I did more than 40 years ago. Traveling all the way from Oakland is Mimi Vaith, formerly of Rochester, New York, and also of Ithaca, and a longtime friend. From Seattle, Paul's dear close friend Lee Jones and his wife Victoria Irwin. Victoria also was a journalist who long time worked for the Christian Science Monitor. Lee went to Cal with Paul, worked on the McGovern campaign with him, and moved to Boston with him in the early 70s. All three of us met, as you've heard, at Victoria Station in Boston in 1973. We were all doing different things, and the restaurant was the way to make some money because everything else we were doing was political, and there wasn't a lot of money in that. I was teaching as a substitute in Boston, and it was during the Boston busing riot some of you may remember or have read about. And that was pretty crazy days, and Paul was always very helpful in talking about issues after school, et cetera. Of course, many old friends of Paul's from his working journalist days, as well as his years at the J School, are also here, and we'll hear from some of them in a moment. To those I know from the occasional evenings at the ringside, when I would meet up with Paul next to the Trib, so sorry to see you, actually. Meeting Paul was like sailing through a sudden squall after a clear day on the water. He was all arms and legs and Kramer hair and a long ponytail back in the day. A staccato delivered mass of opinions, insights, deft notations on life, and an ample body of accumulated knowledge already at that point that convinced you quickly here was a man of substance and acute observational powers on life, politics, and the Red Sox. As I speak, I can hear Paul yelling at me at the moment, "Who the fuck puts deft in a sentence anymore?" 40 years or so raced by. Paul was the type of friend where you could see each other weekly and then monthly and then every few months as life got in the way. We lived our parallel lives, but anytime you gathered, it was like picking right up where you left off. As Stephanie said, he was as solid as they come. The past year was hard, but I cherish my memories of our many walks and talks. He was on the net, learning everything he could about his medication and about treatments and everything else. He was emailing and responding with his students and colleagues almost to December. It kept him alive a bit longer, I'm convinced. It fed his brain, it was good for his soul, he felt needed. So 2 short stories, and then I promised to be done. One from 30 years ago and one from about a month ago. Steph and I were at Paul and Annie's rental house at the time in Pleasant Hill in 1986. House was large and had a pool and was owned by an Oakland vice cop. I'll leave it to Harry Harris, who I think I saw here, to tell you how he pulled that off on an OPD salary. Anyway, the Sox were 1 out away, actually 1 strike away, from winning their first World Series in about 70 years. Paul was taping the game on those big old VHS tapes you may remember. The rest you know. Ground ball to Buckner, yada, yada. They lost. Paul yanked the tape out of the machine, said to Steph and I and Annie, "Follow me," stormed into the backyard, and threw an impressive 20-yard strike into the pool. If only the Boston bullpen had anyone that accurate. Neither of us had to say to each other anything about watching Game 7. It was a non-starter. We didn't, they lost. The second short tale is from a day or two before Paul passed on December 24. He was in and out of consciousness by then, but we were talking, or rather I was. At one point, I said, "Paul, you really stepped in some shit this time." After what seemed like an eternity, a small smile spread across his peaceful face into almost a full Paul grin that we know. He was good. Unfortunately, death was also part of the rich pageant of life.
I'm Carolyn Newbergh. I've worked with him at the Tribune. Well, let me be clear about one thing right away from the outset. Paul did not want a shindig like this. He said so. He told his dear wife, Anne, no funeral, no organized event. Well, Grabowicz, too bad. As you would say, fuck you. We need this sense of community. We need to celebrate you together. Paul had an amazing second act to his career here, helping guide this graduate program, as we've heard, and the profession into the digital era of journalism. Way before most of us old school journalists, he recognized the promise of using many new media tools to tell stories in a fuller, more powerful, more nuanced way than we can simply do with print and photos alone. But as you know, Paul did have a first act in journalism, and it wasn't too shabby either. So many people in this room today are proud to be former colleagues of Paul's from his Oakland Tribune days. Reporters, editors, and marketing people from the old and the new Trib, including Anne, and including my husband, Kevin Fagan. So I just wonder for a moment if those of us from the Trib could stand up and just so we can see who is here from the diaspora that is the Oakland Tribune family. Thank you. We knew Paul as dogged, focused, dedicated, serious, tough, mentally very strong, cynical, spirited. He held himself and others to the highest standards and had a built-in bullshit detector. He was a newsroom leader. He was outspoken. His thin, gruff facade fooled no one on the paper, just as it didn't fool anyone here. He swore like a sailor, even to management, whom he called shitheads. And he was still always respected for his authenticity, his intelligence, and his insights. He could be feisty, loudmouth, a wild man at times, even outrageous. But more important, he was kind, he was good-natured, generous of spirit, charming. He had a big heart, and he was fun. He was modest and self-effacing. He was beloved by just about everyone. We all recognized him, felt a special connection with him. I had the great good fortune of being on a two-person investigative team with Paul for 2 years. We dug, for example, into stories about then Assembly Speaker Willie Brown and one of his developer friends, or into the still unsolved mystery of the bombing of Earth First environmentalist Judy Barry's car in Oakland. In the aftermath of the Loma Prieta earthquake, we wrote a series we were particularly proud of. We investigated reports that there were some unscrupulous consulting geologists who, for a price, would say that it was safe to build in places where in fact it really wasn't. That is, to build things like houses, schools, a community center with a daycare center on unstable ground. We waded through documents for months, visiting government offices all over. Paul sweet-talked the women, yes, it was usually the women behind the counters, smiling at them and calling each one a peach to soften them up so they would copy documents for us or ease our access to records. He would just turn on the charm, and it always worked. Yes, Grabs, I'm giving your trick away. What we found in this paperwork was chilling. Over and over, these geologists would say that a fault line that had been mapped for 100 years or more, traversing a piece of land, in fact, did a sudden dogleg turn just at that one property, somehow averting it. And then the developers who had hired these geologists would convince the cities that this was true, that everyone else who had ever studied the site had been wrong. And as a result, they won permission to build there. This was hair-raising stuff to us. We would sit over drinks trying to understand how these consultants slept at night. And when we interviewed the worst among them, a surprisingly old, mild-mannered, almost feeble man, Paul's questions were gentle, sympathetic, posed as an effort to understand how this man could legitimately come up with such extreme findings. Well, he couldn't. And as a result of our series, this scoundrel became the first geologist to lose his license to practice in the state. I mentioned earlier that Paul was fun, and I know you all know it's true. I have a particular memory of long drives home from doing our research, and Paul shoving a tape of his favorite pop music from the 60s and 70s into his stereo. Then the two of us belting out these songs from the Eagles, the Beatles, David Bowie, John Lennon, the Temptations, the Doobie Brothers, the Beach Boys, and others for hours. We were letting our hair down. It was freeing and bonding and just plain fun. To switch gears, I just thought I'd say a little about this past year. For most of the time, he did well with the chemotherapy and radiation, with no terrible side effects other than losing his hair and feeling fatigued. He had braced himself for worse side effects, but his body was strong through most of it. He was quite resilient and hopeful most of the year. He was pretty funny when he started the chemo. On that first day, he walked into the room where about 10 people were hooked up to treatment in cubicles, and he stopped by a number of them, smiling, saying hello, and he stopped by and trying to strike up a little conversation, trying to lighten the atmosphere. But he met stony silence, eyes that wouldn't look into his, faces that said, "Leave me alone." I teased him that he was like a social director on a cruise ship with a very tough crowd. He was determined not to let his spirit sink, but he did hate being sick. Staying home so much made him stir crazy. As Anne would tell you, he was very moved by the outpouring of phone calls and emails he received from friends and students wanting to be there for him. Well, the last kind of chemo that was tried on him turned out to be too much for his body and had to be halted. This strong treatment caused him to decline rapidly. Unfortunately, his tumors were resistant to all of the chemo and radiation he had received. The night he passed, Anne played those classic oldies for Paul that he loved so much, all through the night. Anne, so attentive and loving, wanted to surround him with familiar sounds, with comforting sounds. I suggest that sometime when you're in the car, you might want to crank up the volume on a song you love and sing it out full-throated and think of Paul. For those of us who did not get a chance to say goodbye to Paul before he passed or to let him know how much he meant to us, I leave you with something Paul said to me years ago on the road that I know was still true for him. I asked him then if he was aware of how widely loved he is, which I said was pretty remarkable given how he could be one ornery bastard at times. He looked at me in the eye and said seriously, with none of his self-deprecating humor, "Yes, Newbergh, I know they love me."
It's quite a gathering. First of all, I want to thank you, Anne, for the invitation to speak today. You can see how many lives Paul touched. I had the good fortune to work with Paul at the Tribune in the 80s and 90s when we were both reporters there. My first day at the paper, Paul suggested we get a drink next door at the ringside. And it's the bar right next to the ringside. And I thought, what a great idea, a bar right next to the newspaper. And so that was the first of too many times we'd end up rehashing the day and talking journalism over a shot and a beer. That was his favorite combo in those days. I learned a lot from him. Paul was meticulous in how he reported and wrote his stories, even how he organized his files. That impressed me because a lot of reporters don't have the discipline to do that. If take it from me, if you were doing something illegal, you did not want Paul building a file on you. That was going to come to a bad end. He made the people around him better just because of his high standards. We worked together on stories, just like Carolyn on after the Loma Prieta earthquake. We worked on stories about freeway construction standards, and we also did stories that I remember the most about political corruption in Oakland. And at times, we were ahead of the FBI because of Paul's sources and his street smarts. It was just exhilarating for me to get a call from one of my sources who would say, "Hey, the FBI was just here, and they, maybe 3 or 4 days after we had interviewed them, and they were asking the same question that you guys were." So that was different for me because I had never worked with somebody such a good investigative reporter. One sure way to make Paul angry, though, I saw this a few times, was to say, well, we just need a quick and dirty version of this story. Make a couple phone calls, get a quote, add a few graphs, that'll be good enough. Quick and dirty to Paul was more profane, more obscene than any possible variation on the word fuck he could come up with. That would, you could see the steam coming out of his ears. Common sight in those days was Paul would be standing on Franklin Street in the late afternoon. I was just around the corner at the side entrance to the paper. He'd have a cigarette in one hand, notes in the other. You could see him mentally organizing his story before he went back upstairs to write it. If you said, "Hey, Paul, you should quit," he'd say, "Well, the cigarettes help me focus." He always felt like that he just got this laser ability to organize his stories because of the nicotine, But if you got him on a bad day, you can guess what he might also tell you, Once, we had some real highs and lows at the Trib, of course. We had the old Masters of Disaster era where we were doing first the earthquake and then the fire, and just it seemed like every year some cataclysm had fallen down on Oakland. Once after the newspaper changed hands, the news hole shrunk really drastically. Paul and I did a story, and an editor cut it to 2 paragraphs, but he left our double byline on it and ran it on the front page. So you can only imagine the grief that we took that night at the ringside. One of our friends, who was a banker friend from San Francisco, said, "Hey, how does that work? Did Paul write the first graph and you the second, or was it the other way around?" I suppose we probably should have seen that as a sign of where newspaper print editions were going. And I decided later Paul most likely did, the way he jumped into digital and new media later on. Over the years, we became friends, in times of uncertainty or trouble. Say, you're torn over a job offer. It means you got to leave Oakland, one of the best news towns I've ever seen. He was there to listen carefully and then offer his thoughts. Just like you heard before, he was also the best man when Judy and I got married. And in a lot of ways, Paul seemed like everyone's best man every day. At our reception, when it was time for him to give the toast, Judy says she remembers thinking, please don't say fuck in front of our parents. And of course he didn't. He ended up giving a very touching speech. I think the closest thing he came to it, we were living in D.C. then, and he said, "Craig, get your ass back to California." That was his. A few years ago, several former Tribune staffers got together for dinner just to catch up and reminisce. And I asked Paul that night if he was thinking about retirement, because we were all getting up in that closer to that age. He really looked at me like I was crazy. You could tell that he really loved what he did at the J School, and he knew he was making a difference. And so many times during his life, and especially at the J School, Paul passed on knowledge and skills to people who will remember him for years. Excuse me. They in turn are going to pass that on to the people they touch. Excuse me. So in that way, Paul will live on for a long time. Rest in peace.
Good afternoon. I'm Kate Coleman, and I've known Paul and Ann for 35 years, longer than most of the students in his grad classes have even been alive. I can tell you during those 35 years, Paul never changed, altered his voice or his beliefs. He was a true force of nature, the likes of whom we won't see again. When Ann asked me to speak today, my first response was, it's not a church, right? How can you talk about Paul without being totally irreverent and using quite a few cuss words? Ann said, he would expect nothing less. We know Berkeley is the birthplace of free speech, and we all know that no one's speech was freer than Paul's. Paul, Ann, and I met when we worked at the Oakland Tribune. Ann and I were in marketing, and Paul, of course, in the newsroom. Paul had been assigned to interview the VP of Community Relations who was spearheading a campaign to get a hotel built in Oakland. Paul traveled from the smoky halls of the 4th floor down to the 2nd floor where those money-grubbing asshole marketing people were. He ran into Ann, who recalled that he just stopped, speechless, couldn't say a word, and just stared at her. Ann asked if he needed some help, and she pointed him in the right direction. Paul's article was a pretty straightforward business piece, and yet he found many reasons to get back to marketing for just a few more questions. And each time he would stop by Ann's office to chat her up. In those days, as had been mentioned, most of the young Tribune folks would drop by the bar next door after work. Eddie Butler's Ringside was a dark, red Naugahyde booth kind of joint that just served beer and shots. And since Ann and I didn't drink either of those, we would ask Eddie for white wine. And with a snicker, old Eddie would reach under the bar and pull out this 5-gallon jug of something and pour it for the little ladies. I believe the appellation was beaver piss. Yeah. One night at Eddie's, Ann was being hit up on by a reporter who was very nice, but she had no interest in. And Paul came to the rescue, and a group of us went together to sit at a table. That was the beginning of a 33-year love affair that only deepened with time. Paul and Ann dated for 3 years before they got married, and for 3 years, he delivered a single long stem rose to her office every week. This is a side of Paul that many of you never had the opportunity to see. Because we all know he was the world's best curmudgeon, or at least the world's best actor playing a curmudgeon. I had never met anyone like Paul. Foul-mouthed, cynical, he was also brilliant, very brilliant, funny as hell, and completely devoted to the craft of journalism. I quote Martin Snapp, who was a newsroom colleague of Paul's at the Tribune. If you were a politician on the take, or a developer covering up the fact that he was building on a dangerous earthquake fault, or someone in power who was abusing his authority, Grabs was your worst nightmare. The guy who would never rest until he unearthed the truth. One of my most vivid memories of Paul was the day I was assigned to take the brand new Tribune Board of Directors on a tour of the Tribune Tower. The paper had just been purchased from Gannett by Bob Maynard, and Bob had assembled quite a few luminaries to be on the board, among others, Shirley Temple Black, child star, adult diplomat, Alex Haley, the author of Roots, Mervyn Morris, the founder of Mervyn's Department Stores. On the tour, we ran into Grabowicz in the hallway, and I introduced him. Paul turned to the board members and said, "I don't know why you'd want to be here in this shitty hellhole." He was so irreverent. You couldn't help but adore him. And all of you did, I know. As we honor Paul today, allow me to make a few suggestions. For the students, remember all that he has taught you, please, because he loved you and he believed in your talents. Remember his passion for the truth, his unbending ethics, his excitement about the future of digital journalism, and his ingrained belief that the world will always need exceptional journalists to, quoting Phil Graham, write the first rough draft of history. Paul was not religious, but I am. So allow me this, Paul. I know I will see you again. We can have a drink, debate politics, make fun of all the assholes, and laugh like crazy until you tell me to fuck off. At which point I will say, "You too, sweetheart."
My name is Neil Henry. I'm an emeritus professor at the J School and a former dean. And I don't know if I can get through this without using the word fuck. And I think it's going to be a 1,000 batting average for every speaker here. In 2008, the School of Journalism received a 2-year grant from the Ford Foundation to, in essence, revolutionize our core curriculum. The aim was to incorporate digital skills training into our teaching of J200, the introductory news reporting class, and in so doing to build local news reporting sites online in service to neighborhoods in the Bay Area. Paul Grabowicz was at the center of that transformation, and we worked closely in those years to improve instruction and the school's public service to the community. With energy and resolve, he poured himself into the project, teaching multimedia skills, overseeing the rollout and production of the news sites, and leading the school into the new age. I had known Paul for many years by then, and had become well familiar with all the adjectives associated with his personality. All of those adjectives are true, as we've heard from previous speakers. He could be crusty, he could be irascible, he could be skeptical, bordering on the cynical. He could also be outrageously irreverent. If the marketing department at the Oakland Tribune was filled with pinheads and shitheads, the campus bureaucrats were withered under his criticism. Indeed, many mornings we greeted each other thusly in the hallway, making sure there were no students within earshot. Me, "Good morning, asshole." Him, "Fuck you," with his middle finger proudly outstretched. That's how he treated me as dean. But his crustiness, skepticism, and irreverence couldn't mask what he really was deep down: a passionate, caring, dedicated teacher and journalist, and a loving husband who believed deeply in the old journalistic ideal of comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable, and holding officials accountable. One of the important duties as dean is to write periodic reviews of faculty members for salary increases and promotion. As part of this process, it's important to assess the faculty member's creative output and his or her teaching record. Paul's record was astonishing, including his work with a colleague in the architectural school on campus in building a virtual online version of Oakland's old 7th Street jazz and blues corridor dating back to the 1940s and 50s. But what was most remarkable in preparing Paul's promotion case were the glowing tributes to his drive and dedication as a teacher and heartfelt thanks from students that expressed to him for changing their lives. One former student perhaps described best when he wrote, quote, "Perhaps more important than the information itself was Paul's interactive teaching style. Paul never simply lectured us, he engaged us. I learned not only how to tell a good story, but how to tell it in any medium. Today, I am the managing editor of an online news magazine that reaches an audience of 3 million viewers a month. Without Paul's help, I would not have had even a fraction of the skills necessary to apply for a job with the organization, let alone reach a management position so quickly." You can multiply that review of his teaching and the effect on that student's life multifold by the many students whose lives he touched. Paul built the Knight Digital Media Center from scratch, and his reach and influence became nationally pronounced as he led digital skills training for working journalists from news organizations around the country. But no matter how big and influential he got, he never strayed from his roots as a working-class kid who had dedicated his life to shoe-leather reporting and the magic of researching the wonders of public records, democracy's greatest gift to the public. And more importantly, he never lost track of those at the center of his professional world, the beloved students in his classes. When I think of Paul, I see and hear his many incarnations in my mind. The prototypical bad Santa during the holidays, where he dressed up as Santa and went around with his finger outstretched. The heavy, exasperated sighs he would let out in the middle of faculty meetings during especially tedious discussions. The lone figure standing in the courtyard at the end of a long day, deep in thought with a cigarette dangling from his lips, his legs perched on a bench. But most of all, I hear his laughter when I think of him. It was a full-throated cackle that began in his chest and ended up somewhere high in his throat, and it was best heard in the most unguarded of moments, like the time I came into his office one morning and heard him laughing with glee about something he was looking at on his computer. He showed it to me. It was a short video he apparently had discovered on YouTube, made by a Norwegian comedy team, and was entitled Medieval Help Desk. It centered on a fellow in a monastery attempting to explain to a befuddled monk how to use the newly invented technology of that time, the book, which was recently introduced to replace the scroll. The monk in the video asked for help from the medieval help desk because he couldn't understand where the text went at the end of the page. Couldn't understand the concept of turning the page. So the fellows told him, just turn it like this. And the look of revelatory surprise on the monk's face as he repeatedly turned the page back and forth and saw that the sentences indeed continued on the back just tickled Paul no end. That's how I'll always remember him, a man in love with his work, one always able to find mirth in the excitement, incongruities, and occasional absurdities of his age. And he will live on vividly in the memories of the hundreds of students who learned from him, the colleagues who worked with him, and the many who loved him.
The first time I met Grabs, I was a wannabe J School student hunkered down in his office. I was put there to take a timed writing test, a last hurdle to clear before I could gain admission to the school. He strolled in as I was frantically typing, took one look at me, and hit the play button on a toy hamster he kept on his desk. It sang the 1970s disco hit Kung Fu Fighting and danced around, twirling nunchucks. Had I known the guy, the proper response, of course, would have been, "What the fuck?" Instead, I think I said, "Are you kidding me?" With an impish grin, he answered, "Newsrooms are distracting. Get used to it." And so that test went, this stupid hamster providing the soundtrack as I laughed, muttered obscenities, and typed my way into the grad school. Grabs made an impression, and I remembered him when I got to Northgate Hall. For the next 2 years, and as my master's project advisor, he continued to crack me up, even as he taught me. He had plenty to teach all of us. I stand here as a voice of students who were at the school when the idea of new media was especially new. Grabowicz was tossing around language and predictions that sounded to many of us like crazy talk. He chatted about this wacky concept he called weblogs or blogs. Students gasped in disbelief when he said subway riders would someday read newspapers on things called tablets. He went further off the rails and said we'd be able to scroll through reading material by touching screens. And I don't know what he was smoking when he peered into his crystal ball and told us that newspapers were heading south. I was going into print, and I didn't want to buy into any of this madness. I was the oldest person in my class and about as technologically challenged as they come. I fumbled my way through his Intro to Multimedia reporting class, crashing pretty much every program I touched. But that was okay, not just because I was going into print, but because he treated me with nothing but patience, respect, and good humor. Years after I graduated, with my tail between my legs, I flew back to the school for a training workshop he was offering. He greeted me with a smile and a much-deserved, "I told you so." I weighed in with a handful of former students before coming here today. They shared their own stories of the successful blogs they went on to create. They were empowered by what Grabowicz had taught them, which landed them gigs in places as prestigious as the New York Times and Sports Illustrated. Other people marveled at the tools he'd armed them with in his computer-assisted reporting class. With that class, he made us smarter. He was not only ahead of his time, he was ahead of our time. As one J-School friend said, he was an old-timer and we were a bunch of kids, yet he was the most tech-savvy person in the room. In fact, as one classmate reminded me, he was so tech-savvy, he was finding photos of cats on the internet to send to his wife, Anne, long before the rest of the world got into that game. Grabowicz and cats, he had a soft spot for them. When one friend came back from reporting on an animal shelter that was closing, she told him about a cat who sat beside a sign that read, "I'm old and I bite." Grabowicz turned to mush and told her she had to go back for that cat. She'd never owned a pet before in her life, but she listened. 2 weeks and a bite to the finger later, she had cat scratch fever, and I'm not kidding. But for 12 years, thanks to Grabowicz, she loved that animal. Grabowicz was, as one classmate put it, the perfect blend of crankiness and compassion. He'd stand in the courtyard, a cigarette dangling from his lips, happy to piss and moan with anyone who'd join him. He'd flip us the bird and greet people with the endearing phrase, "What the fuck do you want?" And Grabowicz in the role of Santa, of course there was nothing better. He'd grumble in that red suit, whiskey bottle in hand, passing out cigarettes. The best part is he'd act like he was so annoyed that he had to do this every year. And yet there was no place else he would have wanted to be. His gruff exterior was hilarious because he was so clearly a teddy bear, one friend said. He would do anything for his students and reveled in our successes. Grabowicz was honest about who he was and where he'd been. He wasn't ashamed to talk about how little he'd been paid as a newspaper reporter. He shared his journalism mistakes, the tough lessons he'd learned, and he reminded us to never be too cocky. He taught and lived with humility, which was no small thing in that J school. As one classmate perfectly put it, he was always so down to earth and helpful in a place with plenty of big egos. The other night I was thinking back to that hamster on his desk, and it dawned on me that it was the perfect symbol of who Grabowicz was. He said he had it to ward off all the squirrels that would often congregate at his office window. But the thing is, the squirrels only showed up because Grabowicz insisted on feeding them. It was so him. Grabowicz was one of a kind, a true original. He made the world and the J School a much more colorful place. He was a visionary, a gift of a teacher and a friend, and he was our most lovable curmudgeon. And I speak on behalf of so many former students when I say that we were just so lucky to have him. Thank you.
I'm standing up here in front of you all today, feeling that there's no way I can express what it is I'd like to say about Grabowicz. I've searched, but I can find no words to capture what's in my heart. No words to capture the impact that Grabowicz had on our lives. No words to capture the feeling in the pit of my stomach when I imagine a world, no less a J school without him. Sorry. But as I struggled over what I would say, I began to realize that Grabowicz had already given me the advice I needed. If ever we were confused over which way to go with the story, he'd gently remind us to get the fuck out of the classroom and start talking to people, goddammit. So that's what I did. Grabowicz will be forever remembered by one of his students for how much he cared and how greatly he was loved in return. No matter the event, big or small, he showed up, another of his students told me. He took the time to join us every single time. His door never closed. That's what another student remembers most. He was there for her with a tissue when she cried in his office, and there with real-world advice when she sought tips on sending a pitch. Never send a goddamn emoticon to your editor, he told her. One student remembers how Grabowicz wasn't the type you'd expect to be the architect of such a forward-looking program. But soon enough, that student realized that Grabowicz indulged in his crusty old newspaper man persona just to throw people off the scent. Still another will remember how Grabowicz believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. And what will stick with another of my classmates is how, on the second day of grad school, Grabowicz warned us that we were all fucked. Yet 2 years later, there he was on our graduation day, pouring us all shots of whiskey, his eyes wet with tears. As for me, I remember a sign that he used to have hanging outside his office. Sorry. For the better part of the 2 years I was at the J School, I thought it said, "Ask here." I did. You all know what I'm talking about. A couple months before graduation, I took a closer look. In small letters, it said, "Don't." As in, don't ask here. To me, that was Grabowicz. His sarcastic, prickly façade was in such a small font that it was almost unreadable next to his enormous heart and his always open door. I had the good fortune of being able to tell Grabowicz how much he meant to me a number of times over the past year. I told him it was he who made the J School a place that we call home, that he constantly inspired us to do better and reach higher, that he changed not only my career but also my life by being in it. And I know he did the same for countless others of you. I thanked him for making our multimedia clan into a family. So it will probably come as no surprise to you that he responded with 2 thoughts. First, he told me that he always felt he wasn't doing enough for us. And it made him wonder what the hell the other professors at the J School were doing. Besides besides Coachy and Jeremy, to make me feel that way about him. And second, he told me, if the cancer doesn't kill me, surely all these good feelings will. When I let him know I was moving back east this summer, I told him that maybe he would luck out, and the distance would decrease my bothersome "just checking in on you" emails. He wrote back, "Glad to hear you're finally getting out of here, and I'll be rid of you." Although, in my experience, there's no correlation between students' proximity to me and any decrease in irritating emails and/or other inquiries. You're right, Grabs. You can't get rid of us now. You can't get rid of us, not even now. In fact, I've put Jeremy on the case to figure out how all those irritating emails can still be delivered to you upstairs at that J school in the sky. To say that we'll miss you, Grabs, is the understatement of all time. Our J family will never be the same without you, but it is forever better because of you.
Coachy and I decided last second we're going to swap. My name is Jeremy Rue, and I worked really closely with Grabs these past several years, along with Coachy at the J School. We both had offices. He was in the center office, and I was in one office, and Coachy was in another. I've only known Grabs for about 10 years, and I say only because these past few weeks and kind of organizing some of the photos and talking to Anne and others have been really kind of a journey of discovery of the incredible depth of who Grabs was and the massive impact he's had on just so many people over so many eras. There's this famous quote that a teacher affects eternity, that he can never tell where his influence stops. And I think it's clear here today, seeing all of you, that Paul will embody that saying. I just want to share a few words about the Grabs that I knew. He was the one that hired me initially at the school, along with many others. And these past few years, we grew really close. We started carpooling into work together because I live out on the other side of the hill. And we'd have these great conversations, especially at the end of the day when we decompress and just talk. He became like a father figure to me in many ways. He really brought me up and challenged me and taught me. He taught me how to teach and how to navigate academia. At one time we had these conjoined offices, there was this partition and a window between our offices. And he'd greet me every morning with a knock on the window and just give me the bird pretty much every morning as I looked up. And we've heard here today a few things about Grabs and his demeanor and his penchant for profanity and kind of a crankiness. But anyone who truly knew Grabs knew that it was an act. It was a pretty convincing act. It was, there were some times he really had me going. But here's the thing, is if you spent enough time with him, you'd know that he might forget. You'd see these glimpses where he might forget the act and he would show his soft side. And the truth is to be told that he loved the students deeply, and he loved the J School. Even after he was diagnosed with cancer and undergoing chemo, he still came to class. The students watched him throughout his last semester and bought him hats as his hair is falling out. When he stopped coming in and when he got too ill to come in, he'd still always ask about how they were doing and ask about their projects. He would go to the end of the earth for them. And up to the very end, just even weeks before his passing, I mean, he was still working hard, sending emails. He was doing things like fundraising for their master's projects and trying to help them out in any way he could. We would Skype him into classes and meetings when he wasn't unable to make the journey to school to attend. He sat through this marathon curriculum committee meeting via Skype And even though he was on sick leave and had no other reason to really do it, but he believed in it, and he believed in the school and its future. There are so many stories people have been sharing, these moments we all had with him, and I hope, after this is over, that people take some time to share stories with each other and others who didn't know him as well. But there's a couple of little things that I remembered that I just marked down. The advisees from his 2014 class, they had this nickname for themselves. They called themselves the Grabowicz. I thought it was cute. There was this time Joanne, who, by the way, was amazing at helping to set this up along with Julie. And I just thank you, Joanne, for making this amazing. She's our school administrator, and one of the, she just really went above and beyond last night bringing things. But she sends this email called the Tangerine Challenge, which is a meditation exercise that she sends to students to help relieve stress. It's about peeling a tangerine by yourself, and then the subsequent video that Paul sent out to the school of him stomping a tangerine into pulp in the courtyard. And then there was a graduation speech he gave where he directed the graduates to stand up and loudly declare that they weren't chow chow, just hamburger relish. And some of the Tribune people might know is a reference to a famous local story where some reporters entered some store-bought relish into a county fair canning contest and won. It was a metaphor to not take your journalism too seriously. But there are just so many stories, too many really, and it's going to definitely be weird without him. The first day Coachy and I came back to the work after he passed, we just both sat in his office and for about 3 hours just reminiscing, just like we did. Those are the things I'm going to miss most, is just the way our chats that we'd have together, just endless chats about anything, journalism, future, life. He was our mentor and our friend. And to Grabs, I say peace and good vibes.
I have to do this in typical Grabs fashion. He would want this. I would light it if I could, but I know I'd be dragged out of here. It's an art to keeping it in your mouth when you talk, and he was really good at that. There's a lot of there's a lot of recurring themes going on. Thanks to him and Neil, I have a single name now, like Prince. You just call me Coachy. Thanks for that. I like to think of life as a really long bus ride that we're all on. And people get on, the crazy homeless person, and you want them to get off as soon as possible. And sometimes people get on and you strike up a conversation and you want them to stay on. God damn you, Paul. As long as possible. And in 2008, when Neil and Paul hired me, Grabs got on my bus in a cloud of smoke, cursing, his middle finger waving everywhere. He was truly one of a kind, and I was really lucky that he chose a seat next to me. And it is heartbreaking that it just wasn't his stop yet. Anne said it best when she said he wasn't done yet. Sorry, this will help. See, it's helping already. And we spent a lot of time together when our offices were merged, And I just want to paint a little picture of his office, because Grabs was a pretty simple guy. He almost wore the same uniform. He was very private. But I knew when Grabs put something up in his office, it meant something. Like, I was like, what is that? I need to see that. Like the little kung fu thing. So those of you who haven't seen Grabs' office in the last 5 or 6 years, I just want to paint a little picture. Lynn referred to the "Don't Ask Here" sign, right? Another one was a gigantic world map, very National Geographic-esque. But there was a twist on it, and always threw you off when you walked in, because the whole map, not purposely, but was made to be upside down. And the map was titled, "Who Said North Was North?" And it's the whole world upside down, right? Kind of, I think, a metaphor. Another thing I love is a 20 by 30 poster called "Beef Made Easy." And it's every cut of meat from every part of the cow and where it comes from. I think it was a little nod to all the Berkeley vegetarians that would come up into his office and probably couldn't stand looking at that poster. My favorite, which I will admit to have stolen already from his office, is a small sign that reads, "The beatings will continue until attitudes improve." And this was a real shocker, and I know Gorney's here, and this is going to shock her. Grabs railed against long-form written articles, and particularly the New Yorker. But he put one up in his office, and it's a little long, believe it or not, and I was going to read it, but I encourage you. It's by Garrison Keillor. It's called "The End of the Trail," a New Yorker article. He put it up. It's the funniest thing I've ever read. It's about a future dystopia where smoking is not allowed. And that probably scared the shit out of Grabs, so he kind of put it up. There's also a few framed images of his 7th Street project, which he was really, really proud of. And that was years before VR. It was years before anything. And it was really, the project that he did was certainly ahead of his time. And in sitting in his office and trying to put this together, there was a very small statue of Sisyphus pushing this huge boulder. And I thought about that, and I don't know where he got that. I don't know whether he brought that in. He often displayed some things that students had given him as a gift. But Sisyphus is a Greek myth about a king who is condemned to push the rock up a steep mountain over and over until it gets to the top and the rock slides back down, and he's stuck in this eternal cycle of pushing the rock up the hill. And I looked for an interpretation of what that meant. Grabs would hate this, but this is me. And Camus had an interpretation that said, "One must imagine Sisyphus as happy. The struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart." And I can't tell for sure if Grabs identified with this Sisyphus statue and kept it on his desk for personal reasons or not, but I certainly do imagine Grabs as happy and moving to new heights with a full heart. Grabs and I shared being only children, both having lost our parents very young, and he certainly became my mentor. He didn't want to be my mentor. He specifically told me that. But he became my mentor. He did. But again, one of my favorite Grabs moments, a few of them that I'll share, plus some advice that he gave me over the years. It was one of those nights that he would stay a little later than normal, and he would let his favorite tunes bleed out from his office. He would take the volume up. And it was a little shocking to us. It wasn't a part of Grabs that we would often see, and he would start singing at the top of his lungs. Normally, there were no students around. And then, every now and then, right when you might get, I remember one specific times, Al Green, like sitting on the dock of the bay, and I was like, oh, I know that tune, and Grabs is singing it, and I'm in my office, and I was starting to get in tune. And right when we were like, a string of curse words would come out, probably because he was reading some email, and then he'd go right back into singing, and it was this constant back and forth. But it was really a wonderful memory. And I had this next The advice Grabs gave me, I was going to say, this is not safe for work, and those of you who didn't, who are offended by the F word, you should probably step out, because I'm going to say about 15 of them. But clearly, the dean dropped some F-bombs, so I think I'm good. Like I said, I made Grabs my mentor, and I used to write down his words of wisdom. And last night I went through all of my notebooks. I keep notebooks during meetings, and times that Jeremy and I would spend in his office. He'd hate that I wrote all this down. And I found some advice that he gave me over the years that I'd like to share with you. The first one goes back to November 2008. Me. Grabs, I don't feel like I'm fitting in with the faculty. Grabs, fuck it, be yourself, kid. All that matters is that I like you. Now stop whining and get the fuck out of my office. The lesson there is find a mentor, make them like you. A month later, my first semester, a month later, me. Grabs, I'm having trouble deciding what grades to give my students. Grabs, fuck it, give them all A's, nobody cares. Lesson, nobody cares as much as you do. January 2009, after reading my student evaluations, me. Grabs, what do I do? My students hated my class. Now, this is like total Yoda, Grabs. This came out of Grabs' mouth, believe it or not. Grabs, see the problems, fucking fix them. Don't be it. See it, don't be it. I was like, whoa, right? Lesson, don't take yourself so seriously. August 2010. Me, I simply walk into his office. Grabs, are you gonna bitch about something? Me, pause. Grabs, get the fuck out. Lesson, don't overburden your mentor. August 2011, the third week of boot camp. Me, fuck it. Grabs, now you're getting it. You're learning, now I'm gonna go have a smoke. The lesson, know when to take a break. Learn when to take a break. September 2013, me, Grabs, I am afraid I'm not gonna get tenure. Grabs, get the fucking bottle of bourbon from my shelf. Lesson, enough bourbon makes you forget about tenure. Okay. October 2013, Grabs set both Jeremy and I up with a proposal to write a book. He basically wrote the proposal for us and set us up to write a book, okay? May 2013, me, Grabs, our book deadline, oh no. Will you help us write this book? Grabs, fuck no. Lesson, know when to say no. May 2013, me, Grabs, our book deadline is looming and we are nowhere near being done. What do we do? Grabs, another great one. After laughing out loud, get off your ass, get out there and do the fucking work. Nothing in this world, lesson, nothing in this world is worth having. Worth having comes easy, do the fucking work. November 2014, asking Grabs advice on a personal matter. Grabs, you're not that fucking important. It's what you're gonna do about it that matters. Lesson, actions speak louder than words. August 2015, getting ready to teach our first class without Grabs. Me, any advice? Grabs, all advice is fucking useless. Lesson, be yourself. And Grabs certainly was almost always himself. And I just want to end with one time that I literally saw Grabs at his happiest at the J School. And it relates somewhat to the medieval YouTube video that Neil talked about. Grabs, once again, was in his office, and there was something blaring from the computer screen, not music this time. And he had just come back from Art would come around and make his rounds, and Art would generally get Grabs, and they'd go out into the courtyard and share a cigarette. Grabs came back and turned on this video. And Grabs was out of breath laughing. Now, I've never seen Grabs out of breath laughing, almost tearfully. And it wasn't that particular video. It was a YouTube video of an Indian mystic and guru named Osho, okay? Again, I'm only going to paraphrase this. You should see this video yourself this evening, who was discussing the usefulness of the F word. Grabs particularly loved this excerpt. I walked into his office. The guru, and I quote, "It's very healthy every morning for you to do as a transcendental meditation. Just when you get up, first thing, repeat the mantra, 'fuck you,' 5 times. It clears your throat." And he goes on, totally profane, couldn't quote anymore, you should see it. But he goes on to say, "With all the multi-purpose applications for the word, how can anyone be offended when you're using this magical word? I say, use this unique, flexible word more often in your daily speech. It will identify the quality of your character immediately. Say it loudly and proudly. Fuck you." And Grabs went into hysterics and looked at me and flipped me off and said, "Fuck you." So, fuck you, Grabs. Thank you.
So at this time, we wanted to open the mic up to anyone who wanted to share some thoughts. We just asked to keep them brief because we imagine there'll probably be a lot of people. And also there's some refreshments and additional things. Please grab a drink, grab a Santa hat, take a picture of the cutout that his wife brought. He's out in the lobby or foyer. And so at this point, and please, for those coming up to share thoughts, we ask to take conversation into the outer area. So yes, if you have any thoughts to share, please come up and maybe we can form a line. Thank you.
Hi. I'm Harry Harris with the Oakland Tribune. I've had the privilege and the good fortune of knowing Paul for more than 35 years. I first met him in 1980 when he began working at the Oakland Tribune, which was in a kick-ass, don't take any names, paper that was admired and respected nationwide. He fit right in with an eclectic assortment of journalists who graced our newsroom, including reporters and photographers who packed guns, kept bottles of what was not aftershave in their desks, had fist fights in the newsroom, and one man who once hung up on Bob Maynard claiming he did not believe it was him calling. Paul always stood out as the best of the best, someone who could whip out a story with ease, no matter what the subject or how close the deadline it was, and whose investigative skills were legendary. Just ask some of the people Paul's investigative stories sent to jail or unemployment lines or political oblivion. He was one of the best investigative reporters I have ever known. He could be a bit serious, if you can believe that, but also had a sense of humor, and actually a caring and sensitive side, as his 29-year marriage to Anne will attest. If Paul had a soft spot, it was for Anne. I used to enjoy occasionally getting his goat, particularly when he was working rewrite and I was filing stories from the cop shop. I fiendishly enjoyed dictating leads to him because he would type away before realizing I was having a bit of fun with him. Like the time a firecracker was exploded at Oakland High School and my lead was, "The day started with a bang at Oakland High." Or the time some marijuana was found at Mountain View Cemetery and I tried to get by him, "A plot of pot was found at Mountain View Cemetery today." After cussing me out only the way Paul could, he would chuckle and then we would put together a story that would pass the editors, even if there might have been a cliche or two still included. I was lucky to be able to cover some of the big stories of the times with Paul, from drug gangs, serial killers, the Unabomber, con men, corrupt city officials, corrupt police unions, just too many to really name. But obviously, you've heard about the earthquake, the firestorm. A lot of people here probably don't know that Paul was the first reporter to actually get the story for the Oakland Tribune when Polly Klaas, the little girl from Petaluma, was murdered, and they arrested Richard Allen Davis. Paul was the first one to get the story that the evidence that linked him to the crime was his palm print found at her house. Another one that we got involved with was Earth First, and he and I were approached by an agent who wondered if we would be willing to write a book. We agreed and made plans to take a leave of absence to write the book. I was particularly optimistic because Paul had already had one book published. Well, an outline was prepared and shipped off, and we got word a few weeks later, at least 17 times if I recall, that no publishers were interested. I like doing shorter stories with Paul because corroborating longer pieces could be painstaking to say the least. He would not submit it to an editor until he had read it 3 or 4 times, making sure that the facts were accurate and there were no spelling or punctuation errors. That shows what a true professional he was. I will tell you that Paul was the main reason I never left the Tribune, even though he did have some offers to go. When he left briefly to go to the Contra Costa Times, I started almost immediately working on him to come back, which he eventually did before finally leaving for UC, where he added more well-deserved accolades to his legacy. Paul was a beacon of integrity and objectivity, and just as important, what we do as journalists, had the ability to forge a trust with his sources, be they police, the cop on the beat, commanders, especially the Oakland Police Department, federal agents, prosecutors, politicians, and even a few criminals who still respected him even though his stories about them were not flattering, to say the least. I will miss you, my friend. You made me and a lot of others much better, not only professionally, but for your friendship.
So I knew Paul before the lovely Ann, and hanging out at Eddie Butler's ringside. And we'd walk in, we were in on the same fantasy baseball team, and I'd say something like, how about Timmy Raines for Eddie Murray? He'd go, you're fucking kidding me. I said, well, do you want the fucking trade? He goes, yeah, I'll take the fucking trade. Give me a drink. Hey, come on. And that was Grabs. He was just a great guy. He was well-rounded, but I am very impressed of the life that he built with the journalism school. It's incredible. So here's to you, Grabs. Good job.
Well, I've known Grabs for a long time. We kind of passed in the night at the Contra Costa Times. I fixed his computer once. I think he flipped me off. And then I went my way, he went his, and one day I get a call from a friend of mine, Marcia Parker, who is now working at the school. And I was coming back from working in journalism for 20 years. And they wanted me, I'm a tech guy, I'm the tech director at the J School. And they wanted me to come in and look at the J School and see if maybe I was interested in helping them out. And so I met with Marcia and Paul in a little Italian restaurant close to his house. And Paul remembered me, and we talked, and for about an hour and a half, he laid out everything he wanted to do at the school. Now, mind you, the technology at the school at that time, and this was back in 1997, 98, was no technology. It was a hodgepodge of stuff. There was like nothing there, and I asked him, I said, well, this is a great idea. How are you going to do it? Do you have funding? You going to put in these computers and this? He goes, I don't know how the fuck we're going to do it. So I don't even know where we're going to get the fucking money. He says, can you do it? And so there started this journey where they drew me in. They were so convincing that they had this grand plan to make this J School so far in the future. I said, well, I'm in. Bring me in. And that started these last almost 20 years of, he brought me in there. He's responsible for me doing what I've been doing for the last 20 years, and I can't thank him enough for that. I can remember throughout the years where he would be teaching a class, and I was always trying to stay one step ahead of his thinking, so that when he wanted to teach something that was progressive and cool and in the future, I was thinking ahead of him so that maybe I would give him a platform that he could actually bounce off from and say, hey, we got this really cool stuff, now we can teach this really cool class. But I was never always that much ahead of him, and I can remember countless times of a student come running into my office, Grabs is in the upper newsroom, and this isn't working, and that isn't working, and I'd drop everything, and I'd run up to that room, and I'd walk in the door, and I'd look at him, and I go, what's up? And he goes, I don't know what's up, just make it fucking work. So, and this is how it was year after year, and it was great, and I have to say that you know, all these years, I think I finally caught up to him. I mean, he got to the point where he wasn't cursing me all the time, and I think he thrived in that whole technological environment. It just made him kind of glow. I'll only tell you one other story. You know, his love for animals. Most of the people don't really know, if you just knew him from the J School, how much he really loved animals. And I remember shortly after I got married, we had a 100-pound German Shepherd, and we were going out of town, and we needed somebody to look after it. And I asked Paul, I said, do you know any place I can, you know, board my dog? And he goes, you know, he says, bring him over to the house. Stan and I we'll take care of him for a week. Don't worry about it. It's okay. I said, you sure? He's 100 pounds. He says, yeah. So we bring him over and we drop him off at the house. And I didn't know he had like 6 or 7 cats. So here's this 100-pound dog, and I drop him off, and he didn't know my dog was a 100-pound German Shepherd. So I said, you sure this is okay? He said, oh, yeah, we'll make it work. So we go away, and a week later we come back, and we go to pick up the dog, and I don't see any of the cats anywhere. So I looked at him, and he's standing at the door with the dog and the leash, and I go, so how did it go? Was he okay? Was everything okay? And he goes, oh yeah, everything's fine. Everything was fine. He says, don't bring this fucking dog over here again. I'm not going to say goodbye to Grabs, because all the years that he lived in that building, you can't walk in there. You can't go into any place in there without seeing his influence, without feeling him being there, without knowing that he's there someplace. He permeates the walls. He permeates the classrooms. The people that he taught and who have come back to teach are now carrying on his legacy. It's just, so I'm not going to say goodbye. I'm just going to say, you know, I'm going to walk into the building every day. I'm going to smell that smell that is the J School. You can't miss it. I'm going to look around. I'm going to know he's in that building somewhere telling everybody to fuck off. And I'm going to be happy to know that he left that legacy in the building.
Hi, my name is Kevin Jones, and I'm a former student of Grabs. And, oh, hey, everybody. And I was also a TA for M2, and I just wanted to kind of reminisce about the Unabomber lecture. Does everyone remember the Unabomber lecture? And how did that thing end? Does everyone remember how that ended? With fuck Lowell Bergman. And what was so hilarious about that is, I remember the first time I saw that, I was like, doesn't he work here? Like, is he really put that in huge words on a PowerPoint behind him? That's amazing. And then when I became the TA, I noticed he did that every year. So he was constantly saying that. But, you know, to show how beloved Grabs is, Lowell Bergman is still here today. So, I mean, it just goes to show how much people appreciated him and loved him. And I just want to say, too, that it's really great that Coachy and Jeremy are here and what they said, and they're going to do really great things with the school because, I mean, you could tell he loved them, and they're amazing, and just the fact that he glommed onto them and brought them into the school just shows how forward-thinking he was and how much he cared about this school. And I just want to say, too, that it just really sucked that it had to happen now because I kept in contact with him too, not as much as I ever, as I like now. And, it just kills me that the one thing I wanted to do was just bring my kids over to him and just tell them, this is exactly the man I wish I could be. And that's all I want to say, so thank you.
My name is Lee Jones, and my wife and I, Victoria, are from up in Seattle. I think I may have known Paul longer than anybody but two people who were in this room. And I've always considered him my best friend. I've never stayed very close. I think I've seen him maybe twice or three times in the last 45 years or so. I want to start by thanking Mr. and Mr. Grabowicz for giving us their son. I also want to thank folks like Stephanie and John and Leslie, who in all of these years have done such a good job of taking care of my best friend. And I also want to thank all of you. I use a lot of profanity too, but I've made a promise to myself I'm not going to use a single one of them today. Paul taught me a lot of them, but I learned some of them without him. Paul was a free spirit, and in this day and age, a free spirit exists in all of us, but we're discouraged from exercising the free spirit, and oftentimes we see folks younger than us come along, and they annoy us, or they upset us, or we think they're pushy or they're shovey, and we sometimes try to get the free spirit out of them. What I would encourage you to do is take the lesson of somebody you took so great care of, that you clearly loved, that you clearly appreciated, that clearly benefited you and all of the institutions in which you believe and all of the work that you do. And do the same for someone else. Support that person too, even if they use a profanity, even if they smoke, even if they drink a lot. I've seen Paul down in one night 22 Bloody Marys. I once had a son, I have a son, when my wife and I lived in New York, and every year New York has a St. Patrick's Day a day parade up and down Fifth Avenue, and one along the Park Slope, Brooklyn. And one day, and they give away green bagels, and we were pretty inexperienced parents, and so he got a bagel, and he ate this green bagel, and we didn't think much of it. And the next morning, the toilet bowl was green. And my wife and I were in a panic. We didn't have a clue what was going around that was turning kids' pee green. It turned out to be the bagel. Incredibly, Paul drank 22 Bloody Marys in a row, and it didn't seem to turn his pee any different color. I mean, he was the same old guy every day he woke up, and maybe it was that mantra he said to himself. But just do me a favor, he was a great man. And in this group of this audience, there are many great men and many great women and many great children. You made the son of a bitch flourish. Make somebody else flourish too. Thank you for having me.
I think we're going to recess, but before we do, please just join me in thanking the people who brought this together. Jeremy, hang on. Let me ask, Joanne Straley, please stand and wave. Julie Hirano, Michelle Hare, Chris O'Day, Roy Burrill, Laura Clivens. Who did I leave out? Anyway, thank you. Thank you all for what is just immense, a terrific event. You're welcome to stay. There's plenty of food and drink. You want to stay and mingle, we'll put the lights on. Enjoy.